Hi, everyone. My name is Suzi Takahashi, and some of you know me from the movement faculty here at the studio. And I was truly somewhat intimidated when Tom asked me to speak on the coattails of Isaac Butler because he's such a rock star speaker. But in fact, in the last couple of years, I have been teaching some of the material about Asian theater and Asian diaspora theater over at the Theater Studies department and at NYU. And I'm really honored to share with you today what I've come to learn about the history of Asian Americans, as well as Asian American theater here in this country. So what I'm going to talk to you about today has a lot to do with history in a larger sense, as well as theater history. And although I did go to college and have a background in graduate school in theater history, I really became a student about Asian American theater only a few years ago. And I didn't come to it through an academic way. I came through it, as Tom was saying, as an artist. And I think that that's a really interesting way for somebody who didn't exactly love history always growing up to re-meet some of these things that in a school context didn't mean as much to me as they did as an artist. It all happened about in 2016. I was approached by a theater festival, and they were commissioning artists to make new work in the celebration of the 100-year anniversary of a woman's right to vote in America. And as I often am, I was asked to make a piece that was particularly expressing my experience as a Japanese American woman in America. And I always feel a little funny and dread being in a position to represent all of any one type of person. And particularly, I realized that has been true about Japanese Americans, because the truth is I've always felt like a little bit of a fake. And I say that because to be Japanese American in this country means that your defining historic moment as a people revolves around one of the most egregious moments in our country's history, this event called the incarceration. And it was something that happened during World War II. And it was a moment in which, hard to believe, but our government forcibly removed over 120,000 Japanese Americans. And these were people who were mostly United States citizens and mostly children under the age of 18. They took them out of their homes, they stripped them from their constitutional rights, and they placed them for the duration of the war in concentration camps. And people look back on that event and say, well, what crime did they commit to have their rights taken away? People say the crime was to have Japanese blood or to look Japanese. Now, luckily, my family did not have this particular story. My dad, he came here in the 1950s. He went to graduate school, he married an American woman, and he then decided to stay in the States. And I grew up as a child in the 1970s and the 1980s in New Jersey. And when I was growing up there, we didn't do things like speak Japanese. I didn't know any other Japanese Americans. None of my other Japanese family had immigrated here. It was just my dad and us. And I was always taught that if somebody ever asks you, oh, you look really ethnic or really interesting, where are you from? I was always taught just say, I'm an American, without any further question. And other than a few faces on TV like George Takei from Star Trek, I really didn't know other Japanese. So my American experience of being Japanese American was more or less of being alone in my cultural identity. And as you can imagine, none of that was a very interesting matter to write a play about. Desperately trying to find something to write, I decided to give myself an assignment, a creative assignment. And that was to answer a family story that I didn't really understand. And this story had to do with my grandfather. He was a man named Katsunori Wakasa, and he had come to Japan to work in a Texas oil field somewhere around 1916. And our family story was that my grandfather, he instantaneously fell in love with America and American culture. He learned in his time here to speak English fluently. He converted to being a Christian. He has some pictures of a local girl that apparently he was kind of sweet on in his diary. And as much as we know, he was planning to stay here and build his life. And then the family story kind of ends. It's all of a sudden in 1923, he picked up and he moved and went back to Japan. And we never really understood why. So through my research to write a play, what I realized I was actually finding were pieces of a picture of what life would have really been like for somebody like my grandfather in America in that time period. And I was really humbled to realize that what I have always thought of as the American dream, and the American dream is something, it's a dream that most people here, most of our families have at one point aspired to, was actually legally unavailable to my grandfather. And it would not have been available to people like him until 1952. So today, because of researching this play, I feel like I have this much richer understanding, not only of my family's immigration story and how that was shaped by history, but I've started to think about those same socio-political forces that were at play to begin to understand and think about what I have come to understand about Asian American theater and American theater as well. So today, before I tell you about the Asian American theater, and for today, at least from 1800 to 1900, I need to share with you a little bit about the history of America and about what being an Asian person in America was for context, so we can more deeply understand how they were being reflected in their theater and on their stages. And before I can even do that, I have to make some caveats. Academics really like caveats before they speak. First, I'm going to say that I'm going to use several different terms and languages to refer to humans with Asian genetic material who are geographically located in the United States. So be ready. Sometimes I'm going to say Asians in America. Sometimes I'm going to say Asian Americans. Later, I'm going to say AAPI people. And I'm trying to use these terms that are sort of relative to the time period and what they meant, but it's kind of a work in progress. So bear with me with that. Second thing to know about this lecture is I'm mostly focusing on Chinese, Japanese, Korean Americans, as well as occasionally some references to East Asian Indians and Filipinos. Now, just to be a reminder, there are many other Asian countries and many other Asian American immigration stories to that, but these 5 countries, they really represent the majority of the first wave of immigration patterns in the 20th century. So I'm going to focus on them. Another thing just to say as a caveat, for those of you who are raised outside of the United States, you've probably noticed that any conversation in America about race and identity and representation is probably A, heated, and B, probably a way that you have not necessarily talked or think about these issues in other places. And this is particularly true in Asia. So just because a person might look phenotypically Asian to you, it doesn't mean that they necessarily share this same point of view about these issues or the same history. So today I'm really talking about this group of people who are American citizens, who are culturally raised American, who identify as being Asian American. And again, it's not everybody's point of view and everybody's story. Also, before I begin now to tell you about the early immigration, I just want to bring into this space the fact that Asians, like all other immigrant groups to America, we participated too in the settler colonialism on the unceded lands of the indigenous people who were here before us. So with those caveats, I'm going to tell you a brief introduction to the story of Asians in America. So historically, Asians, they're often misunderstood as being always and forever recent immigrants to America. You hear this term, FOB, or fresh off the boat, and it's often wielded as like a pejorative epithet. But in truth, the story of Asian immigration, it begins much, much earlier. It actually begins in the year 1587, when Filipino sailors who were working on Spanish galleon ships, they abandoned their posts, jumped ship, and escaped into the bayous of Louisiana. There was a small town that was settled there called St. Malo in the bayous outside of New Orleans. And for generations, the community there, they worked as shrimp farmers, and they intermarried with local Blacks. And the remains of this town, it actually stood where it was from 1587 until 1967, when it was finally, its remains were destroyed by a hurricane. We know that there was at least one East Asian person from India who was working in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. We know that there were Indian freemen who worked in the shipyards of Salem, Massachusetts, as well as indentured servants and Indian slaves, right? And their experience is only documented us in the sort of cracks of history. One of the places that you could find about their existence is in newspaper announcements that are still filed and kept that were reporting when slaves were would run away and were asking for people to return them to their masters. So I'm going to read you now an actual article from the 1800s from a Virginia paper. And this is what the article says. It says, Richmond County, Virginia, July 14th, a runaway about the 20th of May last. An East Indian named Thomas Greenwich. He is a well-made fellow, about 5 feet 4 inches high, wears his own hair, which is long and black, and has a thin visage and a very sly look, and a remarkable set of fine white teeth. A reward of 40 shillings will be paid to the person who delivers to the subscriber, besides what the law would allow. Signed, William Colston. So, in the original Constitution of America in 1776, there was actually a lack of clarity about who is really going to be a citizen of America in this new country. And it was decided that both men and women who had at least been here for 2 years, that they were welcome to become Americans, although it was always very clear women were not included to vote in that time period. But individuals who already were in the United States at that time, people who are African background, people who are Asian background, and people who were Native American, indigenous people here, they were not considered eligible for citizenship under the original Constitution. And yes, that means that slaves, enslaved humans, were not legally Americans. They were countryless people at the time of slavery. This ruling was further clarified because people weren't exactly sure who qualified and not in an act called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And that stated that very clearly that only free white male immigrants were eligible to become naturalized citizens, to take on the American identity as a citizen. So at the very foundation of this country, immigrants from Asia were not legally ever allowed to become Americans. And without citizenship, they had little protection and privileges by the law in our country. So, for example, what that really means for a person who's Asian here, it means that for most of the 1700s into the 1800s, it means that you're not allowed to vote. It means that in a lot of places and cases, you can't attend a public school. It means you can't intermarry with somebody who's outside of your own race. It means you can't own land. It means you're not eligible to give testimony in a court if somebody does something to you. And even a child of somebody who was of Asian descent who's born here on US soil was not considered eligible to become an American citizen. This exclusion of Black and Asians from citizenship, it would remain until the end of the Civil War. And it's after the Civil War, a little bit after that, in 1868, when finally they worked out all the legal paperwork and the emancipated slaves were given full rights as American citizens with the 14th Amendment. But this act, it didn't include Asians, but what it did do is it kind of opened a crack in the door for Asians to start to ask, well, why can't we be citizens too? So that question in the courts is going to take about 10 more years before it finally passes into law. So in 1876, the Supreme Court heard a case called Wong Kim Ark, which is this name you still hear today as an important legal court case. And in that court case, they ruled that children who are born to an Asian descendant who's in America are now officially American citizens. At the time when this law was being debated, one of the important things to kind of wrap your head around is that the West philosophically did not understand that ethnicity and race could be things that were inseparable. It meant that how you looked and meant what country you had to be from and what culture you had to follow, what identity you had to follow. And now it was really in this time period that it was like the first time that people started to have to like grapple with and think, all right, how can a person who's of Asian descent be culturally American? And it really called on us as a country and as a people to kind of have a total cultural paradigm shift to be able to imagine that people of different races could unite in a shared American ethnicity like we believe now. So when you kind of add up all the math, it's really only 145 years ago that it became even possible to be called something like an Asian American, somebody who's of Asian descent, but in fact is an American citizen. And again, that sounds like a really long time ago, but it really is just about 4 generations. So it's within a person's memory. And I like to use my own family as an example. So there's me, I'm born in the 70s. There's my dad, he's born in the 30s. My grandfather, he's born in 1890. It's really, and these people are, I didn't meet my grandfather personally, but he's somebody who's very much a part of my life and my memory system. So this idea of that there were only people who could be Asian Americans is something that's, again, much closer than we might actually realize. So taking us back to the time of the Civil War, in fact, this question of being Asian in America was relatively a minor question. It was a philosophical question more than anything, because the amount of Asians in America was still relatively small. Records kind of show us that there was a community of about 200 men from China who lived in San Francisco who were here doing business. And there was some small communities of Muslim Indian itinerant merchants all up and down the East Coast, as well as Filipinos, as we said, in small areas. But all of a sudden, as we sort of hit the mid-1800s, there's going to be a significant wave of immigration. And this immigration is going to specifically come from China. And in 1852, we have 20,000 individuals who arrive through San Francisco to participate in the gold rush, all from China. Now, at first, California kind of freaks out, and they try to pass all these laws that's going to curtail having so many people from one particular place arrive. And they do this by trying to impose all these taxes. So if you want to be in the gold rush and you've come from China, you're going to have to pay a lot of extra money to be able to have the privilege to mine. Another wave follows them. In 1865, about 15,000 more people come. And this time the gold rush is kind of over. But they come for a new reason. They come because they are recruited to work on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this time it's not only Chinese, it starts to be Japanese too. And for many of us raised in America, there's some awareness, the Chinese came to build the railroad, that this is where the beginning of the story of Asians in America starts to really take off. Now, to tell you a little bit about what railroad work was like, how historians remember it, they always say that it was particularly brutal work, and that the Asians, the Chinese who came in originally, they were often given the most dangerous work assignments. So a lot of what particularly the first wave of laborers came in to do was they came in to try to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains with dynamite. And they would put dynamite in a tunnel and they'd explode it, and they'd run out in time, hopefully, before the mountain gave way or before the snow on the mountains gave way. And it was considered to be one of the most dangerous jobs that you could do on the railroad. There is a report that after one particularly bad day where a lot of things went wrong, they sent the remains of 1,200 Chinese men back to China in a box. Right? So we're talking about a huge number of people who were really, at the truest sense of the word, expendable labor. Immigrants at this time period, they were often the targets of violence. A lot of the reason because they couldn't say, well, I didn't do it, right, in a court of law. And things like lynchings that we tend to only associate happening to African Americans in this time period, as well as massacres of communities of workers, are documented, as well as a lot of examples of labor injustice. And one is kind of really almost hard to believe. So, we said they came to build this railroad. They finally had the railroads meet. They had a big party. They had a big celebration. Anybody who was a Chinese laborer was not invited, right, to have this big photo opportunity of the meeting of the railroads. And more than not being invited to the party, they were not allowed to ride the railroad back home that they just built. So the Chinese laborers had to walk back to California to be able to even decide if they were going to leave or they're going to stay. So here we are now. We have the sort of first blush of Asians in America, and a couple of tropes, ways that Americans are thinking about them now that they're here, start to emerge. And I bring these up because they're going to kind of follow us over the next 145 years. The first trope that starts to emerge is that Asians are only here to come and make money, but then they always go back home. So they aren't really actually interested in being an Americans. They aren't interested in assimilation. And number two, there's a trope that starts to emerge that Asian men, particularly, come to America to purposefully steal jobs from Blacks and from white Americans. Now, this trope stems from actually sort of a true-ish fact that many Chinese are actually recruited by owners of companies to come and fill this massive labor shortage that the emancipation of the slaves has created. And because companies, for other reasons, didn't want to hire now freed Blacks, they were looking for the source of cheap labor, and they ended up filling that void with the Chinese. In terms of women, tropes arose around them about the fact that they were either prostitutes or that they were carriers of disease, sexual disease as well as plague. And to this day, sometimes when things go wrong in our culture, historians will point to these tropes as these underlying social tensions that still linger in our culture today. And two things to kind of keep in mind. One is that there was a really famous case that's maybe a little out of your time frame, but in 1982, there was a case where a man named Vincent Chin, a Chinese man, a Chinese American, was attacked, and he was killed in a bar in Michigan. And he was attacked by a small group of white auto industry laborers. And the reason that he was attacked and killed was because apparently they thought he was Japanese, and people in the American auto industry were so angry that the Japanese car industry was sort of taking off in that time period. Another way that scholars sort of point backwards to look at some of the things that are happening today and to try to explain them is that in this recent rise of anti-Asian violence that occurred during the pandemic, statistics actually showed that the most likely person to be attacked for their race were actually Asian women. And they were particularly reporting that they were being attacked with this rhetoric that they were carrying coronavirus. And people look back and say, wait, that's not a new thing that has been used against particularly Asians and Asian women in this country. So escalating social tensions that I've been telling you about through the 1800s, they led and they started to coalesce into this overall cultural suspicion that actually got a name. It got a name attached to it called the Yellow Peril. And it was something that was particularly against the Chinese, but also against Asians. And people define what is the Yellow Peril as sort of an existential paranoid belief that the West particularly imagined Asia, and by extension, individual Asians, that everybody was conspiring to come and to take over politics, economics, the government. And this ideology was used as a justification that America would need to pass another really important law to be aware of, something called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first time that America ever passed an immigration ban of a specific race of people. And it allowed the US legal means to deny immigrants of all kinds of Chinese laborers, with the small exception of a few diplomats and students who were still allowed in. And it set this sort of really strict visa system. So now anybody who was Chinese background who might want to come into the country, and even people who were, again, born here, but were not American citizens, they had to carry papers that said who they were and that they were Chinese nationals. And this made many people targeted to be deported, even people who had lived here for a number of years. So now, having a National Exclusion Act seems like a pretty clear message that we could interpret about how America might have felt about Asians and Asian American immigrants at its time. However, I always like to say history often is much more complicated and contradictory and not so simple and clear than you would think. So one of the things that happens, right, is actually really opposite to what you would think the sentiment of America is. Nationally, we're really struggling to be able to embrace Asians, but internationally, America in 1898 is really driven, like everybody else in the Western world, by imperialist ambitions. And we do a couple of interesting things. One, we depose the Queen of Hawaii and we annex her lands, we take over Hawaii. And also, we get the Philippines as a protectorate at the end of the Spanish-American War. And for a country that's just spent maybe the last 50 years trying to expel its Chinese, we have made this interesting political global decision that we're now embracing two Asian countries that's going to force us to ask to have Asians participate and have their place in the American fabric of society. And as America crosses into the 20th century, a lot of these complicated dynamics about wanting to expel and having to embrace start to get mingled and coexist in our culture. A few kind of things I'd like to mention that just kind of make that stew a little more interesting to a person like me. Number one is that this thing about Hawaii, it's not just Hawaii that is now going to be incorporated into America. Because Hawaii is actually a really multicultural community and a community that is really embracing lots of immigrants into its own territory. And why is this? It's because so many indigenous Hawaiians died off with Western diseases that they had all this labor shortage, and they imported and asked people to come in and work from China, from Korea, from Japan. And Hawaii would ostensibly become this sort of like open pathway now from Asians from all over Asia to come to be a part of the United States. Another kind of interesting historical event that kind of shakes things up is actually the earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. I'm from the East Coast, so that earthquake doesn't mean so much to me, but I know that it was a big event in a lot of people's history. But one of the things that happened for the Asian American community is that the building that the immigration records were held was damaged. And a lot of the paperwork was lost, and a lot of people's homes were damaged, and the paperwork was lost. And all of a sudden, people were here, and they couldn't prove to the government that they weren't born here or that they weren't the son or the relative of somebody. And it opened the door again for people to be able to come in because they could claim that they already had citizenship, and America couldn't prove it otherwise. Another thing that's going to happen that's going to start to mess things up as we get into the 20th century is that World War I, anytime we get a world war, there's an interesting thing that tends to happen back at home. After world wars, there's often a social opening. And a lot of times it has to do because the people who offer their lives to protect our country need to feel like they are rewarded and have a place in our country. And this has happened with the African American community and the Asian community as well now, that people served. Asians who were here served in World War I. People came from Asian countries to serve in World War I on our side, and they were rewarded with this opportunity to become naturalized citizens. So we're going to start to get even more people coming in that way. And the last thing to kind of be aware of that as we're moving forward in time into the 1900s, we've now had, right, since 1878, at least a full generation of people who really are American citizens. They're born here, they're Americanized, even if they are of Asian descent. And those people really want to find a place for themselves. They're able to go to college, they're able to sort of exist in culture, to be part of America, but certain doors are always closed to them. They can't really work in jobs yet, and they aren't able to live all places. We're going to get a generation of people who really, really are going to fight for their place to assimilate. Now, all of these surrounding tensions about Asians and Asian Americans are finally going to come to a loggerhead, to a big pass here in 1924. And this is a moment when America passes the infamous Immigration Act of 1924. And again, this is a really strict exclusionary clause that denied entry to almost all Asians. All Asians except some Filipinos are no longer allowed to come into the country, and they're no longer allowed, again, this possibility of citizenship. It was also used as a way to further expel people who were living here. This law did a bunch of things. It also kind of created a strict quota for other people who were immigrating. And academics suggest that this law was not only targeted for restricting Asian immigration, but was also sort of being used as a tool to restrict European Jews as well as Catholics from immigrating to this country as well. And again, this act would not be repealed until the 1950s. And to kind of loop all this history again, how it began for me back to my family and my grandfather, it is this Immigration Act of 1924 that I actually located and sort of settled on that I think must have been the real reason why my grandfather left. Because I think with all of what he was going through, to have that really passed into law that he was not ever going to be able to be a citizen, he would really have to build a life as an alien, his children would not be citizens, I'm sure, right, if I were him in his shoes, I am sure that might make me choose to go to another place. I also believe that its repeal in the 1950s was the reason that my dad came. With having a possibility of citizenship, he now had access to the American dream. And so with that kind of contextual history of what life was like until we get into the 20th century for Asians, I'm going to start today by telling you now what kind of theater and what kind of artistry were people who were here in this time period able to make. So to start our journey, I'm going to invite you back to a time that's actually even before that big rush of immigration we said in the gold rush. It's 1820, right? It's really early America. And one of the things that I mentioned before, that Asians, again, we were here since colonial times, but the numbers are small. So a person who's not Asian, who's living in America, probably wouldn't have ever met an Asian person or known an Asian person or even seen an Asian person. So how are we going to get Asian performers? Well, the first documented and known Asian performers who came to America and set up a career here are the performers Cheng and Eng. And I don't know if you may know their names for other reasons than their art. They might sound familiar because they are a pair of conjoined twins. They are the original Siamese twins. And we call them Siamese twins because Cheng and Eng were from Siam, which is modern day Thailand. So Cheng and Eng were brothers, twins, who were brought here to be exhibited in a paratheatrical style of performance called a human zoo. We call them that today. Human zoos are not literal zoos like the Bronx Zoo, but instead they kind of encompass a bunch of different types of sort of theater, but they're not mimetic and they don't have like a plot structure, performance venues. And we might categorize things like sideshows or museum exhibits or something that used to be popular called a World's Fair exhibit. These would all fall under categories of performance-like theatrical events. Now, these performance spaces, they did involve that kind of criteria of what makes it theater, that an audience has to be there to pay money and to watch, and the performer has to be doing something. But what the performers did would sometimes involve light artistic events. Sometimes they'd sing, sometimes they'd dance, sometimes they'd physical skills. But a lot of times, performers were actually displayed for physical differences without really engaging any other further type of artistic actions. So today, some of this style, it still lingers in our memory because most of us probably have heard of something called like a bearded lady or something. Like we're aware that there was like a sideshow that exhibited people. But in this time period, because people, American population, didn't know a lot about people from different countries, things like ethnicity and just race alone were enough to be entertaining to a paying American audience. So in 1829, Cheng and Eng were 17-year-old twins, and they are attached by a small strip of cartilage that connects their livers right around their sternum. And they are remembered as being these bright, athletic boys who, in Thailand, attracted the attention of a British merchant. And this merchant saw them, and he had this idea that they would make money if he exhibited them in the US. So the twins were purchased from their mother. They're brought to the United States. They sign a contract with the family saying that they will be returned and that they will be paid a portion of their profits for their performance as wages. And it's understood what they're going to do. It's not like they don't know they're going to go to America to perform. They agree to this. Now in New York City, they arrive and the twins perform in an act where they do physical feats. Apparently they did backflips, they played chess, they learned how to speak English fluently and gave academic lectures. They did all sorts of things. But after 3 years of working for these managers, the twins had received very little of the money that they had earned. So interestingly, when they were 21, they took their career in their hands and they emancipated themselves and they began to tour on their own. And Cheng and Eng were one of the most successful acts of the time. And for 10 years, they performed all over America. They were one of the most successful acts of their kind in America, and they earned enough money in their career to marry, to buy a farm in North Carolina, and to hold multiple slaves. And somehow, in a time period where I just told you for 20 minutes that you could not become a citizen, they actually oddly became citizens. They took on the surname Bunker, and they really managed in a time period where Asians could not do a lot of things to do everything they weren't supposed to do, or believed to do, I should say. Between the brothers, they fathered 21 children. And today, the Bunker descendants, you can watch them on video, they had family reunions in North Carolina where they told the reporter that they have 1,500 people are the actual descendants of Cheng and Eng. And one of their grandsons is sort of interviewed, and they say this nice thing about how they remember them. They say, well, you know, my grandfather might have come to this country because of his physical disability, but he ended up living the American dream. And that's how they view them, as a success story. Cheng and Eng are the oldest known Asian American performers. They are the start of the legacy of what it means to be an Asian American artist in this country. And on the one hand, these men, they really led exceptional lives for their time period. However, historians, they point out things like the fact that although audiences were kind of sympathetic to them at the beginning of their career, they were widely written about and reviewed as being monsters. It's the word they used in the press, and sexual perverts. So their presence in America was enough that they were actually referred to often in something that was culturally going on called the morality movement of the time. And this was a thing that was going on that really sought to kind of police out sexual perversion. It was actually a sort of a social phenomenon that was really trying to argue for the fact that men and women should abstain from sex until marriage. It was really a time period in the early 1800s where all of a sudden this sort of sexuality was really strongly policed. So it's also important to remember that Cheng and Eng, they're performing for this society that may not really have the ability, or a different ability than we would expect, to view them. So again, it's important for us to know that the people who were buying tickets to watch them and how they might have thought about this act, we know that they were people who upheld the practice of slavery. We know that America as a culture was at the height of its sort of negative Native American sentiment, because the Trail of Tears is going to happen in a couple of years. So one thing is important for us to keep an eye on. It's triumphant that they were able to perform, but how they are understood, we really don't always know. And people kind of argue this thing because they had this intersectional identity as being both Asians and as both people of anatomical difference. We don't know how people really conflated or understood or separated those two things in their day. So now the next example of an earlier Asian American performer I'm going to share with you is a woman, a young Chinese woman called Fang Moy. And people actually think that she was maybe even the first Chinese woman to ever step foot in the United States that we know of. And she comes in not too far after. She's performing in 1934. But she too is brought here by European businessmen who also display her in a similar context of human zoos, although she is mostly performing in museum contexts. Now, crowds flocked to see Moy, and she is billed as the Chinese lady. And in her performance, she's dressed in beautiful Chinese clothing, and she sat in this regal chair against a painted backdrop that depicted a Chinese traditional setting. And her act involved a lot of spending time with allowing the audience to just sit and look at her. At times that were sort of arranged, she would get up and she'd drink tea, she'd eat with chopsticks, and she would walk. Now, for Moy, walking was a bit of a loaded task because what was really on display was not her fine strut, it was the fact that she had bound feet. So again, foot binding, for those of you who may not know, was a cultural practice that existed in China from, I just recently found this out, the 10th century to 1949. Who knew? In which a girl's feet would be compressed at the arch by wrapping tight wrappings or cloth around it, and it would create a very small foot where the pad of the heel and the pad of the toe would meet. And the smaller the foot, the more beautiful and higher class a girl was considered for the purposes of marriage. And it was a beauty standard in the time. Moy's feet measured 4 inches. Additionally to her act, Moy was set in a setting that was filled with Chinese objects that were ready for purchase. Although Moy was the main attraction of this act, her handlers were actually merchants. And they had the idea that if they put her in a performance, at the same time, they could sell goods from China, like souvenirs from the show that you would buy. So Moy sat amongst objects, things like teacups and plates that had price tags on them. So as you watched her act, you might also notice, oh, what a lovely cup. And you might buy that and take that home with you to remember your time at the performance. And Moy too, she was really famous in her time, but she also saw little profit from her work. She widely performed across the US. She met President Andrew Jackson. She eventually ended up getting a contract from P.T. Barnum, who was a big employer. You might know him from the circus world. And she acted on stages for 17 years before she disappears into history, sometime around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This idea of reclaiming her life has become a really delicious artistic topic to people today. And there are a couple things floating around that you might be aware of about her life. Recently, this year in 2022, there's a New York Times bestseller novel called The Many Daughters of Afong Moy by a writer named Jamie Ford, who I haven't got to read yet, but people say is a really interesting read. And in 2018, there's a play called The Chinese Lady by writer Lloyd Su. And Su presents his play about her in this sort of series of monologues that span her changing life and the attitudes of the audience to her in a way that he has imagined, filled in her story. It's a play with a lot of great monologues. It's packed with historical information, so it's a great read if you are so interested. Now, for us today, this idea of it's hard to imagine that exhibiting humans could be something that people would do for entertainment. And that's particularly harsh fact, because what, again, is really being exhibited often is race, cultural practice, and physical disability. And just to kind of say aloud, again, we think these things last or are only in an ancient time period, but this practice of human zoos lasted well into the 20th century. There was another really notable case in the early 1900s in 1904, where Filipino communities were exhibited at a World's Fair that Asian American writers like to talk about a lot. One more example of early Asian American theater in this time period I want to tell you about is in 1852, right before the Civil War. And at this time, again, there are people now in San Francisco, particularly here for the gold rush, and there's interest in Chinese culture. So a company called the Tong Hook Tong Dramatic Company comes to play from China to play in San Francisco. Tong Hook Tong is a 42-member troupe of Cantonese opera performers. And for those of you who maybe have never seen Chinese opera, I really, you must at some point watch it for your theatrical education. It is one of the world's highest accomplishments in art forms. It's very different to an American audience and eye. It has all this really striking movement and costumes and music and acrobatics. And Tong Hook Tong performed to sold-out audiences of over 1,000 people a night, right? Again, in the middle of the 1800s, and people would pay $6 a ticket to go to see their show, which, you know, today it's hard to pay $6 a ticket to go to see a show. So, but this show got so much attention in San Francisco that it caught again the interest of Mr. P.T. Barnum, who promised this company really big money if they could get the show to New York, because he thought it would be sellable to a New York audience. So the company somehow managed to get all the way from San Francisco to New York. And when they got here, P.T. Barnum said, "What contract? I didn't promise you a contract." And they didn't have a place to perform. So they tried to put on the show themselves. They were able to perform it a few times in New York City, but they couldn't get the same kind of audiences. There weren't the number of actual Chinese people here who understood it, and the Western audience who did come, some people did come, they didn't really have the means to understand the cultural differences between the theatrical forms. So again, that early example of an Asian American theater company performing in America has faded into history. Now, these three examples of Asian performers working in America are all we have on record. That is all there is for the early history of Asian American performance. It isn't until really the 1900s that we start to see a steep rise in the presence of Asian American theater artists. And although I like to imagine and fill in the gaps that certainly some of those people who must have come to work on the railroad, to pan for gold, they must have had talent and dreams of theater, and those stories, their stories are lost to history. So one of the challenging things that we have to grapple with when you become a student of Asian American theater is that talking about Asian American theater doesn't mean just talking about Asians and people of Asian descent and Asian Americans who perform. It actually also means talking about theater traditions and theater practices that depicted Asians, Asian Americans, Asian bodies, but didn't actually use actors of that particular culture. And we include them in the study of Asian American theater because we feel that it informs, again, some of these questions, some of these issues about how theater is made, understood, and how representation functions today. So what I'm actually going to tell you about next is a form of theater called the Yellowface performance. Now, as we all know, art is a mirror to society, and as a result, the social issues of our days are often reflected on our stages. And as you can imagine, in America in the mid-1800s, the most dominant social issues of this time period have to do with the rising economic, social, and racial tensions that are going to lead to the Civil War. So sadly, we need to kind of remind ourselves for a moment that one of the most popular theater forms at this time period is something called a minstrel show. And a minstrel show, again, is a paratheatrical form. It's an episodic musical variety show that was thematically constructed around a romanticized and racist depiction of plantation life. And this performance tradition is associated with the practice of blackface. And blackface is a word that we know today. We still understand what that means today. Blackface is a performance style comprising stereotypical speech and movement patterns, as well as the use of exaggerated makeup that was used to characterize African Americans. And at the start of this performance style, white actors exclusively performed in these shows. But as time went on, especially towards the turn of the century, an interesting thing started to emerge. Black actors started to wear blackface and perform in minstrel shows because other forms of theaters were segregated, and it was one of the few places they could find work. And one of the most famous actors of this form, a man named Burt Williams, was actually a Caribbean American man who was in this challenging position of having this famous career, but as a person who had to play blackface roles. And I mention this because it's an important thing for us to remember and keep in our sort of historical sight, but also to kind of introduce, there was a very similar performance tradition for Asian Americans called Yellowface that also coexisted in the same time period. Now, Yellowface, it's the practice of non-Asian actors using makeup to darken or to yellow their skin. They often also wear prosthetics or some sort of added thing that they add on to create a phenotypical Asian eyelid. And they also use characteristic speech and movement patterns. So Yellowface was something that was practiced in the 19th century, particularly in a theater style called melodrama. Now, melodrama is a theater form that we might know if we still have this sort of memory that it involves these, shows of tying ladies to railroad tracks and sort of overly blown dramatic stories. Historians, I always argue with this, but historians like to say, well, this was a theater that was made for the lower classes. High class people like Shakespeare, lower class Americans liked melodramas. But it is known and still remembered and still loved by many today because it always had this sort of really twisting plot element. The word cliffhanger that we still use today comes from this theater form because it would have all these really dramatic ends to scenes, things like people hanging off of cliffs or hanging off of icebergs. That would then cut away, and then the audience would have to wait on the edge of their seat till they would get and stay for the next scene. Melodramas always have a lot of dramatic action, and they also often have what people say is a simple worldview. Now, again, I don't like to think that the plots are actually, the people in these plays are simple, but what they mean by that is that it's always something that's arguing or telling a story about good versus evil. And there's always a world where good is going to triumph, right is going to triumph, what's moral is going to triumph. And one of the other things about melodramas is that they used stock characters. So again, in the days before we had psychological characters and psychological acting, right, playwrights wrote with stock characters or archetypal characters. And stock characters have this sort of funny thing about them. They have this ability that when you place them in the context of sort of a world in which all the characters are sort of representing something that's like a generalism, like I'm the daughter, I'm the father, I'm the doctor, right? That stock characters really quickly lend themselves to becoming stereotyped if you're presenting characters who are of a different culture. Melodramas also had an interesting thing to them that they tended to be very topical. A lot of melodramas were written, people really liked to go see new plays and new stories. So oftentimes stories would very quickly incorporate things that were going on all over society. So they become a really great place to sort of witness what's going on in the world at the time and how people felt about it. And we really saw that quickly reflected in the theatrical culture of the time. So around the year 1841, there was a play, a melodrama, called China or Tricks Upon Travelers that was performed. And this play is sort of remembered as being the first one to depict a Chinese character. And it began to sort of set the precedence for a whole character type, a stock type that was based around showing a man, sometimes a woman, who was of Chinese background. And early melodrama plays even had a name for this character. They would always refer to it as the heathen Chinese or the coolie character. Now, coolie, again, is a word that we still kind of hear lingered, and it tends to be used as a sort of a racial epithet. That's something that's a slur for Asian people. But it actually is a term that comes out of a theatrical tradition of melodrama. Now, this character was always somebody who was low status. He was always a comic character. He was often had the job of being a laundryman or a servant, and he was often very bumbling and very childlike. But there was always a distrustful element to this character type. He was sometimes sly. He was sometimes to not be trusted. These characters always spoke in pidgin English, and they were often shown as being drunk and lustful towards white women, which is sort of opposite of being childlike. But now, again, we may think, well, that stereotype is really outdated and old-fashioned, right? We are talking about the mid-1800s. But this is a little out of maybe most of your cultural reference, but in my generation, 16 Candles, John Hughes films were really big. If you've ever seen 16 Candles, that character is pretty much everything that stock character comes from. So it is still, again, creeps up in our cultural memory. So by the 1860s, Chinese stock characters are common enough that stage makeup books that were published in the Civil War actually now have a chapter in them that tells actors how to make their face up to prepare to play a Chinese role. And the interest in these parts started to grow even well into the Civil War years and even after. So the funny thing to think about is, all right, we just learned historically, we have the Yellow Peril, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, America's trying to get rid of Asians, but at the same time, in our theater culture, people are starting to have this appetite to see Asians on the stage. But again, not real Asians. They're interested in seeing white actors performing Yellowface. So one of the other theater folk I would like to introduce you today is a man called Charles Parslow. Charles Parslow is an actor who became one of the leading actors of his generation, and he really caught the American audience's imagination after a Yellowface performance he did in an 1876 melodrama called The Two Men of Sandy Bar. So let me tell you a little bit about Parslow. Parslow is actually a British immigrant himself, and his father was a professional actor in England. His father was an actor in a style called pantomime. Now, for Americans, pantomime, we might confuse it with the art form that our wonderful teacher Bill Bowers does, but it is not. That is not pantomime. Pantomime, in fact, is a type of a British variety show that was really heavily influenced on commedia dell'arte. So people consider it kind of the passing of the baton from the commedia dell'arte tradition. And it uses a lot of physical storytelling and acrobatics. Nowadays, pantomime is kind of, I think, mostly restricted to being performed at Christmas time in England. I don't know if that's true for Brits, right? It's a Christmas tradition. But in the 1800s, it was sort of its own thing. It was its own art form. And Parslow grew up watching his father, along with some of the real greats of the genre and some greats of the theater. There was a man named Joseph Grimaldi. I don't know if people remember his name. He was considered to be the first modern circus clown. And he was sort of one of the leading actors of this pantomime tradition. Parslow's father was famous for an act in which he dressed up and imitated the physical life of an ape. And he brought his famous ape act to America. And as you can imagine, it didn't go over so well on our theater circuits here. But Parslow decided that he wanted to be an actor in the American tradition. And he really excelled because of his background at physical transformation and comedy. His first job was playing Puck in a New York production of Midsummer Night's Dream, and he got really great reviews. So all of a sudden, he had all these opportunities to act. But because of his sort of physical abilities, people cast him in roles that were considered the character roles in the melodramas of the day. So he was often playing women, he was often playing Jews, he was often playing Blacks, he was often playing Irish stock characters. But his career took this very particular turn when, after Two Men of Sandy Bar, he became so popular in the role of a Chinese man that for the next 10 years, he played 23 different Yellowface characters in 3 different plays all over the United States. He was working extensively in a time when no other Asian or Asian American actors were even known to exist. And he was one of the leading actors of his day. So Parslow, again, he acts into the 1900s. The end of his career, sadly, he was penniless and he died in the care of the Actors Fund after a very long and illustrious career. So this use of Yellowface in performance, it's not only limited to melodrama, it becomes a popular theatrical convention in other forms, things like vaudeville. Another really interesting case is a magician, a performer named Chung Ling Soo, and his career spans from 1898 to 1918. And it turns out that Soo is really a Scottish man named William Robinson. And he performed not only in Yellowface, but also lived off stage as a Chinese man as well. His magic act was actually stolen from a real Chinese magician, who actually came to sort of challenge him in this infamous duel moment, but then he didn't show up. So the American audience was like, this man is actually, in fact, the real Chinese and the real magician. And his career ended by the fact that he was accidentally killed on stage in an act that involved shooting a gun. And again, I bring up these examples because one of the tricky things for us to understand is the fact that audiences seem to prefer Yellowface performance than to seeing actual Asians or Asian American perform in this time period. And it's going to carry over into our next time period where the tradition of Yellowface actually is something that is the way that a lot of Americans' audiences end up consuming Asian representation on the stage more so than seeing actual Asians perform. So I'd like to end today by telling you one last sort of apotheosis moment in theater history of Yellowface performance. I'd like to take you to the sort of end of the melodrama tradition, and it's going to be 1900. And there was a very famous melodrama called Madame Butterfly, written by the legendary David Belasco. Now, for those of you who don't know David Belasco, he's an American theater director, producer, and playwright. And he was really concerned with bringing virtuosity to the melodrama stage. He didn't want it to be a low-class drama form anymore. And he was really meticulous in his ability to design set, costume, and lighting effects. And his work really was instrumental in shaping the idea of a modern director that we have in America. So now one of his most famous works is this play called Madame Butterfly. And it wasn't a story that was original to Belasco's imagination. Now, Belasco was always on the lookout for good material to make into melodrama. And he happened to read this short story that was popular in the day by a writer named Jonathan Luther Long. And he saw great possibility in this story. So in Long's short story, Madame Butterfly tells the story of a naval officer, a lieutenant, and he comes to Japan right after the time Japan is forcibly opened to the West, and he takes on a geisha girl in this sort of agreement that he's going to marry her, but in fact, he knows he's going to leave soon and leave her behind. And he proceeds to set up house with her like they are a married couple. Now, in this original story, the protagonist's name is Cho-Cho-san. And as we might know, by the time that Pinkerton leaves, and gives her this sort of vague promise that he's going to come back one day, she's already pregnant with his child. To make the long story short, Madame Butterfly waits for her husband to come back, only learning that several years later, he brings his American wife, Kate, back. And Kate, the wife, feels very morally moved to be able to bring their child home and to raise him as an American. So Although Long swore that he heard this story firsthand, it turns out he actually plagiarized it from another writer. It was a French novel before it was a short story. And Belasco took this story and turned it again into an even more romanticized tale. And Velasco's version of Madame Butterfly, again, became one of the most popular plays of its time. It toured all over America, into many countries, and it soon caught the eye of the composer Puccini, who in 1904 made this new, fantastic, realistic verissimo opera based on the play. Puccini's opera, right, is something that actually ended up outliving Belasco's play and is now one of the most popular pieces of the opera repertoire we still have. But one of the challenging things that has happened is that now we have this beloved classic of European and American theater, operatic theater, that was steeped in the tradition and has historically been performed in Yellowface. And today, a lot of opera companies who still actively perform this opera have this sort of conundrum now. How do we deal with the fact that we have this traditional performance, we have this operatic range that's always been performed by people who are not of Asian descent, and now we have this call for racial authenticity in representation? One of the interesting things is that this question is not exactly new. There was one example in 1914 of a Japanese performer who actually sang this role of Cho-Cho-san. And we'll end with her story today because, again, it's sort of very emblematic of the journey of Asian Americans throughout the 1800s. On the one hand, many people loved her interpretation of the character. They thought there was something about her, the way she moved, the way she spoke, that made the character really believable, very Japanese. On the other hand, critics said, you know what? She doesn't sing the role as well as other opera singers do. And in fact, her really being Asian and nobody else really being Asian makes it confusing to watch the play. One of the things that happened, and this was true, it happened with Chang and A Feng Moi too, is that often after their performances in towns, local doctors or academics or scientists would ask to examine them to prove some sort of theory about them. So Tamaki Miura, after singing a role, was often examined, and doctors discovered that they felt in the time period that her vocal cords were shorter than European singers, and this made her actually not capable of really singing the role in the way that Puccini wanted her to sing. So we sort of leave this time period with this kind of complicated idea for Asians that there have been performers that existed, right? There is this Yellowface tradition, but something again about this idea of being a real Asian body in an American stage context is still not an easy place for performers or American audiences to coexist yet. So because today we kind of focused a lot on the challenging aspects of race and representation and our history, I just want to say that as we move forward in time with things like World War II and the Civil Rights Movement, we're going to see this sort of huge burst of opportunity for Asians and Asian Americans in our theater entertainment. And the next time we meet, I'm going to take you through the 20th into the 21st century, where we're going to meet so many firsts. We have first movie stars, first directors, first playwrights, first theater companies, and really the rise of something that we are all a part of, whether we know it or not, that's occurring right now around us, which is this sort of moment of arrival of the Asian American theater movement, which is one of the reasons why we're starting to see so many people winning in award shows and so many more plays and Netflix series than we ever had seen before floating around in our community. So I look forward to telling you more about that again next week. And thank you so much for coming.